Imagine you're trying to write the definitive history of the 1789 French Revolution, right?
Okay, that's a massive undertaking.
Huge. But your primary source, like the absolute best document you have to work with, is a single book that was published in 1949.
Oh, wow. So way, way after the fact.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, half of that 1949 book freely mixes actual dates with, magical monks and wild prophecies and just blatant political propaganda.
Which is a historian's absolute nightmare.
It really is. But that is the exact nightmare historians face when they try to understand the birth of the early Islamic Empire. Welcome to the deep dive.
I'm really excited for this one because the visual backdrop we're kind of projecting for you today is this shifting mosaic. Picture ancient desert trade routes that sort of fade into these crumbling circular walls of ancient cities.
Yeah, it's very evocative.
We are stepping into this historical landscape where the facts are just incredibly elusive. The timeline is full of blank pages and, smudged ink.
And we're diving into the first few centuries of Islam. But our mission for you today isn't just to recite some dry list of names and battles. We're using Chase F. Robinson's really fascinating introduction to the New Cambridge History of Islam to figure out how historians even managed to piece together a coherent story here.
Right, especially when the physical and written evidence is either missing or heavily biased or, like you said, written hundreds of years later.
Exactly. We're going to see why the eventual political, quote-unquote, fall of this massive empire was actually its greatest cultural victory. So get ready to completely challenge your assumptions about how history is even recorded.
To understand the sheer scale of the problem with our sources, we really have to look at how foundation myths are constructed in the first place.
Oh, yeah. Let's start with that highly celebrated story from the year 763 of the Common Era.
Yes. So the Abbasid Caliph, Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, is choosing the site for what will eventually become the legendary city of Baghdad.
Right. He's out there surveying the land, and he meets this local monk, and he asks the monk, hey, are there any ancient prophecies in your books about a city being built on this exact spot?
And the monk replies that, yes, actually. A man named Miklas is destined to build a great city right here.
And the caliph is just overjoyed. He reveals to the monk that when he was a kid, his childhood nickname was, in fact, Miklas.
It's undeniable destiny, right?
Right. He is the chosen one meant to build Baghdad. But wait, hold on. A random monk magically predicts a powerful ruler's childhood nickname.
It's a bit convenient, isn't it?
I mean, it sounds like a stock fantasy trope you'd read in a novel, not actual history.
You're picking up on the exact right thread there. Because the very same monk and Miklas prophecy is documented as the founding legend for an entirely different city.
Wait, really? A totally different city?
Yeah, a place called Al-Rafika. It was basically a standard foundation trope used to legitimize a ruler's decisions.
So they basically copy-pasted the myth. Okay, so why do modern historians even look at the guy who wrote this down, who actually recorded this Miklas story?
That would be a scholar named al-Tabari, and he is widely considered like the monumental historian of this era.
But when did he write it?
Well, al-Tabari died in 923 CE. The founding of Baghdad supposedly happened in 763. So he is writing about 160 years after the event actually took place.
Jeez. Okay, so if the written record is that delayed, and it's full of these copy-pasted magical myths, why can't we just bypass the texts? We have modern archaeology, Let's just dig up the 8th century foundations of Baghdad and see what's there.
I wish we could, but we can't. The 8th and 9th century layers of Baghdad have been almost entirely obliterated.
Obliterated? How?
You have to factor in centuries of brutal civil wars, subsequent economic decline,
Oh, right.
the devastating Mongol invasions of the 13th century, and then just the relentless march of modern urban development building right over the old ruins. The physical evidence for early Baghdad is simply gone.
That's wild.
Now, we do have good archaeological evidence for that other city, Al-Rafika, but for Baghdad, the crown jewel of the empire, al-Tabari's text is essentially all we have to go on.
Okay, let's unpack this. If al-Tabari is writing 160 years late, and he's including these obvious fables, why is he still considered our best single source? Like, why haven't modern historians just tossed his work in the trash and admitted, hey, we know nothing?
Because we rely on him due to the fact that he was an exceptional historian by the standards of his day.
Right, we can't judge him by 21st century standards.
Exactly. Al-Tabari wasn't writing modern, data-driven history. He wasn't obsessing over census numbers or tax receipts or perfectly objective timelines.
What was he doing then?
He was compiling oral traditions, scattered textual fragments, and historical facts to interpret the deeper meaning of these events. He was living in a time when a massive, unified Islamic state was just beginning to fracture.
So he had an agenda.
A strong one. His work is a deliberate blend of facts, polemics, and prescriptions for how rulers ought to behave. He was writing moral instruction just as much as he was writing history.
Meaning historians in the past used to just take these old texts at face value, like, oh, Tabari said it, must be true.
They really did for a surprisingly long time. But then, between 1973 and 1980, this small handful of scholars published works that completely shocked the academic establishment.
Ah, the revisionist shockwave.
Exactly. They woke the whole field of Islamic studies from this long post-war slumber by asking a really radical question. They asked, can we actually reconstruct the first 2 centuries of Islamic history at all?
Wow. So they looked at the murky waters of these old texts and realized they couldn't even see the bottom.
That realization forced a completely new methodology. The text brings up this brilliant quote from the 19th century historian Lord Acton, and it basically serves as a guiding principle here.
What's the quote?
He said, "The critic is one who, when he lights on an interesting statement, begins by suspecting it."
Oh, I like that. Begin by suspecting it.
Right. Historians of early Islam have to weigh testimony like detectives now. They aren't just hunting for new facts. They are constantly evaluating the bias, the distance in time, and the underlying motive of whoever wrote the facts down.
Which brings us to the black hole of the 7th century. This is the exact time when Muhammad is experiencing revelations, right? And this new empire is just exploding out of Arabia.
Yes, the 7th century.
If that era is a black hole for contemporary evidence, how do we know they didn't just invent everything from scratch out in the desert? Because if you look at the 6th century just before Islam emerges, the records actually aren't terrible.
That's true. The records for the 6th century give us a decent baseline depending on where you look. Like in the Byzantine Empire around the Mediterranean, Greek sources and Syriac sources, usually written by Christians, they give us a pretty solid picture of politics and society.
Okay, so the Mediterranean is well documented. What about further east?
As you move further east into the Sasanian Empire, which covers modern-day Iran and Iraq, indigenous historical writing drops off significantly, and the archaeology lags behind too.
And what about pre-Islamic Arabia itself?
There is virtually zero narrative history and very little archaeology.
Wow. Then the 7th century hits. The spectacular conquests happen. And the contemporary written sources don't just get worse, they slow down to a mere trickle. Even the Byzantine historians suddenly go quiet.
It's a huge shift. And this lack of contemporary Islamic sources fed into an idea that dominated the field for a long time. It was called Islamic exceptionalism.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
The assumption was that early Islam emerged completely detached from the surrounding world, that it swept over the Middle East as this brand new alien force that was totally isolated from what came before.
But the modern scholarly consensus completely rejects that isolationist theory, right?
Absolutely. Early Islam deeply belongs to a historical period we call Late Antiquity. Muhammad was not operating in an isolated bubble. He was operating in the deeply interconnected world of the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius and the Sasanian king Yazdegerd.
So they were extremely aware of these rival superpowers.
Very aware. And the mechanism that drove their success was what we call cultural ambidexterity.
Cultural ambidexterity, I like that term.
It basically means the early Muslims didn't just conquer these massive ancient empires, they absorbed their systems. They didn't come in and wipe out the existing bureaucracies or burn down the administrative structures.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let me try an analogy here to see if I'm getting this.
Go for it.
They weren't like a tiny startup inventing a brand new industry in a garage. They functioned more like a massive, aggressive tech company that acquires its 2 biggest competitors, right? Byzantium and Sasanian Iran.
That is a great way to look at it.
But instead of laying off all the staff and trashing the old software, they keep the middle management. They keep the code that works. They integrate it all and just slap their own new corporate logo on the building.
That captures the practical reality perfectly. When Arab armies conquered Sasanian territories in Iraq, they kept the local Persian scribes employed.
Why change what works?
Exactly. They maintained the existing tax systems because those systems successfully extracted wealth. And from the Byzantines, they absorbed the incredibly powerful concept of marrying monotheism to empire building.
Oh, right, because the Byzantines were Christian?
Right, and the Byzantines believed that God's single universal rule in heaven should be mirrored by a single universal emperor on earth. The Muslims basically adopted that ideological software and applied it to the Caliph, the deputy of God.
So they took the Byzantine ideological software. How did they integrate the Sasanian side?
They absorbed court culture, administrative traditions, and physical architecture. Let's go back to that foundational myth about the circular city of Baghdad for a second.
The Miklas prophecy.
Right. That circular design was not invented out of thin air by a monk's prophecy. Al-Mansur built Baghdad just a short ride away from the old Sasanian capital of Sitchifon. The circular city plan is a direct continuation of Sasanian architectural traditions.
Oh, wow. I had no idea.
Yeah, they physically shifted the center of power from former Byzantine territory in Syria, which is under the Umayyads, to former Sasanian territory in Iraq under the Abbasids.
But wait, were they just mimicking the late antique world, or were they fundamentally changing it? Because the sources mention that early Muslims were primarily political imperialists ruling over a world that was still overwhelmingly non-Muslim.
Yeah, in the early days, they were rarely sending out religious missionaries to convert the masses. They primarily just wanted political control.
Right, so how did they change things if they were just copying the existing structures?
What's fascinating here is that they changed the late antique world by aggressively accelerating patterns that were already in motion.
Accelerating them how?
The most significant shift was the sheer speed at which they fused belief and empire. Think about Christianity, right? It was born on the margins of the Roman Empire, and it took centuries of fitful growth and persecution and slow colonization before it finally became the imperial religion under Constantine.
Oh, right. It took almost 300 years.
Exactly. But Islam fused belief and statecraft in incredibly quick succession. They moved the capital, integrated two rival empires' traditions, and created a unified political reality that matched their religious worldview almost immediately.
Which brings us to the rise and the eventual geographic fall of this incredible corporate empire. So we move into the consolidation phase. The Abbasid dynasty takes power in 750 CE, and they actually managed to rule for 5 centuries up until 1258.
Which is an astounding achievement by any pre-modern standard. They built the greatest land-based bureaucratic empire of antiquity.
Just how big are we talking?
At its absolute height, this single unified state stretched from Tunisia in North Africa all the way across the Middle East to Pakistan.
That is massive. And we need to debunk a persistent old myth right here. There was this outdated historical view that Islamic rule brought about agricultural decay and economic decline in these regions.
Yes, that narrative was around for a long time.
But modern material evidence shows the exact opposite, right? This consolidated empire was driven by a booming Eastern Mediterranean economy. There was massive international trade stretching across the Indian Ocean and deep into the steppes of Central Asia.
It was incredibly prosperous. Baghdad wasn't just a dusty political capital. It was one of the wealthiest, most literate, and most cosmopolitan cities on the entire planet.
But, consolidation eventually gives way to disintegration. By the year 900 CE, which is just 150 years into Abbasid rule, that massive unified state was already breaking apart.
It was. If our historian al-Tabari had traveled west from his home in Baghdad to Morocco in the year 900, he would have left direct Abbasid control in a matter of days.
Really? That quickly?
Yeah. For the rest of his journey, he would be passing through the territories of 4 completely independent dynasties: the Tulunids, the Aghlabids, the Rustamids, and the Idrisids.
It feels like a star expanding into a red giant.
How so?
Well, the core is Baghdad, and it's generating all this intense heat, wealth, and culture. But the outer edges expand so far away from the center's gravitational pull that they inevitably just drift off and form their own separate, self-sustaining solar systems. They don't need the core's gravity anymore, like regional managers realizing they don't need corporate HQ.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
And that loss of gravitational pull was dictated by the harsh realities of pre-modern geography.
Geography, not bad leadership.
Exactly. This fragmentation is constantly, mistakenly framed as a moral failure. The cliché of decadent, corrupt caliphs lounging in palaces while the empire crumbles around them. But the reality is strictly logistical.
Wait, but Rome held its massive empire together for a really long time. Why couldn't the Abbasids? They had similar pre-modern technology.
One word: water. The Roman Empire was built entirely around the Mediterranean Sea. Moving troops, grain, and tax revenue by ship across the water was relatively cheap and incredibly fast.
Oh, sure. It's basically a giant superhighway.
Exactly. But the Abbasid Empire was overwhelmingly land-based. Think about the sheer logistical nightmare of trying to raise an army in Iraq, supplying them with water and food, and marching them across the Syrian desert, the Sinai, and the massive deserts of North Africa.
Just to put down a rebellion in Morocco.
Yes. Assembling and feeding armies across those vast arid distances was incredibly resource-intensive. Disintegration wasn't a moral failure. It was an inevitable reversion to regionalism because the center physically could not hold on to the periphery.
So the political empire shatters into these independent solar systems. Usually in a textbook, that is where the chapter ends with the phrase, and then a dark age began, a golden age lost.
Right, that's the standard narrative.
But this brings us to the final and maybe most surprising insight of our deep dive. This political fragmentation is actually what secured Islam's permanent legacy.
Yes, we really have to separate political history from cultural history here. The 10th century political disintegration did not result in cultural dissolution. What emerged from the shattered empire was a highly resilient commonwealth of independent states.
So they were politically divided, but culturally united.
Exactly. They may have had different rulers, and their armies may have fought each other over borders, but they all operated on the same profound cultural and linguistic software.
Meaning they all used Arabic as the prestige language of administration, literature, and culture.
Yes, and they all utilized the same political frameworks, the conceptual idea of the caliphate or the emirate, and they all shared a commitment to ordering daily life through Islamic law.
So a scholar or a merchant could travel thousands of miles between rival political courts and still be operating in the exact same cultural universe.
Precisely. And the text offers a brilliant counterfactual, a what-if scenario to illustrate just how crucial the timing of this collapse really was.
Oh, I love a good counterfactual. Lay it on me.
What if the massive Islamic empire had fragmented earlier? Like, what if the state had shattered during the intense civil wars of the 650s or the 680s?
Oh, wow. If the empire had collapsed in the 650s, the region would have likely reverted straight back to the pre-Islamic status quo.
Exactly. The Byzantine and Sasanian cultural influences would have quickly reasserted themselves.
Right, so the Middle East would probably have remained a politically divided, Christianizing, and Zoroastrian world with heavily militarized borders along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
But the Abbasids managed to hold the unified empire together for roughly 250 years before it finally fractured. And 2.5 centuries is an incredibly long incubation period.
So it was enough time to cement the culture.
Exactly. By the time the political center finally gave out, the processes of acculturation were complete. Arabic had become unshakable. Even when non-Arabs launched rebellions or secession movements, they did so using the political vocabulary of Islam. You didn't see movements trying to revive pre-Islamic religions. The cultural roots had grown far too deep.
Holding the empire together for those first 250 years was the critical window. The cultural glue had fully set. The irony here is just incredible. The centralized political empire had to break apart for the culture to truly flourish on a local level.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the 10th and 11th centuries weren't a dark age of decline, they were a massive rebalancing. Because you suddenly had all these independent local courts competing with each other for prestige, you get a staggering flourishing of literature, art, and the exact sciences.
And you can see just how resilient this cultural network became when you look at the revolutionary threats that followed, right?
Oh, absolutely. Take the rise of the Fatimid dynasty in North Africa and Egypt. They emerged with a radically different ideological vision and posed a massive threat to the existing order.
But they couldn't undo the culture.
Not at all. Even the Fatimids couldn't dislodge the deeply rooted cultural coalition that had taken hold in the East. Baghdad survived the political fragmentation because the shared language and the religious frameworks proved infinitely stronger than any single army or centralized government.
It's just an amazing historical journey we've mapped out today. We started by realizing that to truly understand the past, you have to be deeply suspicious of your sources. You have to interrogate historians like al-Tabari, who is, writing about magical monks 160 years after the fact.
Right, you can't just take it as absolute truth.
We saw how early Islam didn't just appear out of nowhere, but was the ultimate culturally ambidextrous heir to the late antique world, keeping the Sasanian scribes and the Byzantine imperial ideologies. And finally, we learned that the geographic disintegration of the Abbasid Empire wasn't a failure, but the birth of a resilient cultural commonwealth that spawned some of the greatest scientific and artistic achievements in human history.
And, that critical lens we applied to ancient texts, that is exactly the tool set you need in your daily life today.
Oh, for sure.
In an era of relentless information overload, we are constantly bombarded with narratives, statistics, and bold historical claims. The overarching lesson from early Islamic historiography is that you must always act as the critic. When you consume a piece of information, you must immediately ask, who wrote this? When did they write it? And most importantly, what are the underlying motives making them want me to believe it?
It is your absolute best defense against bad information. And it leaves me with one final, lingering thought for you to chew on as you go about your day.
Let's hear it.
We saw how the ultimate legacy of its Abbasids was secured not by their political dominance, but by the language, the laws, and the cultural software they left behind when their centralized power inevitably shattered. So look around at the world today. What modern global superpowers do you think are quietly laying the cultural software for the next 1,000 years, even as their actual political grit begins to slip? When the physical walls of our current empires finally fall, what myths will remain?